Welcome to Road to Wellness, the podcast. I'm Amy Truong, and today I have the pleasure of bringing in Danika Kelly, who is the CEO and founder of My Normative. In this episode, we're going to explore how flawed data, design, and research gaps continue to overlook women, marginalized groups, and healthcare outcomes. Our guest is going to share insights from her work in health data and research, and we can discuss how the healthcare system can really do better by collecting better data, asking the right questions, and amplifying unheard voices. So again, Danika, I'm so grateful for you to be here today. We met in Toronto, and I would love for you to share a little bit more about what you're doing in your work for our listeners.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that introduction. It was a wonderful event that we met at in Toronto, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to continue some of the interesting conversations that we had. As you said, I co-founded an organization called My Normative, and we're focused on disrupting and closing the sex and gender data gap. My background in health equity is pretty varied, and I've been working in the field for the last 15 years or so. As a result of that, I hold some really interesting hats that I wear in the space with the Commonwealth Women's Network and a couple of other spaces that really focus on the international and global aspect of this opportunity for improvement, the future of health equity.
Thank you so much for your work. It's very important. I study population and public health as well in America, so I think this is important. So I wanted to dive into this big picture of why do you think data matters so much, especially in women's health, and how do you feel like it's currently working or not working? Can you share a little bit about your thoughts and insights on that?
I think this is going to feel like a silly thing to nitpick on right out of the gate. But when we talk about why does data matter in women's health, you and I have talked about before, what is women's health? But one of the things we didn't even talk about when we talked about this in Toronto is that sure, women's health can be a discipline. It can also be an area in which policy is made, but women's health is also the health experienced by women, right? And so it's not just this academic or medical discipline, it's this real health outcome and the lived experiences of people every day. And so when we think about data, it informs, and data is just like information points, right? And trends of information. And so the health outcomes that we see in women globally are driven by the decisions and the information that we have to support that decision-making process, that once it goes into, I'll call it a formal health or wellness space, is formalized in terms of how we think about protocols and diagnostic measures and interventional methods and treatment methods. Data kind of informs and unpacks those. And so if all of those things are based off of considerations that didn't always include women or the female body, that can drive us to, unfortunately, what we see in the data are unequal health across sex and gender.
What do you think in terms of what is causing this misrepresentation in the data? Is it just because we're not collecting women's data? I'm trying to understand, where is the gap? What is the biggest issue that you see here?
That's a really good question. I don't think there's any Machiavellian sort of nonsense going on. No one's walking around trying to do anything here. But I think the medical sciences, as we think of them in the Western context, we like to pretend that they are fully 100% objective, right? But there is still cultural and societal legacy within these spaces. Then we can dabble in quote unquote patriarchy later on, but I think even the origins of modern human anatomy are based off of animals, right? So Galen's work in the space on the modernization of the human anatomy figures, that still heavily relied on animal features, including apes, which is funny because this is around the same time we were rejecting Darwinism. So there's all sorts of cultural context tied up in the ways in which we have historically thought about the human body, broken down the components of the human body, recognized the limitations, function, performance of the human body. And inclusive in that is that the female aspect of the anatomically modern human has always been this kind of weird additional afterthought, right? And so there's been kind of an intentional, well, we don't really know, so we're just going to pretend it's not there. And that's, you just don't know. And then there's this training that's reinforced that otherness and that weirdness of the female body that's led to an increased and widening gap in the knowledge that we have on how, quote unquote, the human body operates in a normal context, i.e. a male context, versus what actually happens.
Could you share possibly an example of a study that you may have gone through, or maybe somebody who comes to My Normative looking for data, for example, to fill a certain gap in their research protocol that may have missed something so significant that you think is a poor representation of that particular study for just the overall general population. We can talk about specific to women as well. Do you have any specific examples in your mind right now?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really famous, really recent one that I think people will find really topical. And so I'm going to just continue my thought on like the way by which we've thought about the modern human body is limited, and they're kind of so it makes it so that anything we do that's for everyone is actually designed for the male body as a proxy for the female body. And so this influences what we decide to collect and capture, right? So if we don't think menstruation is an important part of this thing that we're doing for everybody because everybody gets it, and so menstruation couldn't possibly be an important variable to capture, or perimenopause or pregnant or postpartum, then we don't capture any of those variables. And so we don't understand how they interact with whatever the thing is we're studying or intervening upon. And so really, really famously, the COVID vaccine that came out recently, there was a huge outcry from the menstruating population when the intervention started to be applied broadly, because nobody in the clinical trialing process bothered to capture, because why would you? Why would you capture menstrual health data in a COVID vaccine, which is something that hits males and females hypothetically indiscriminately? Why would you need menstrual cycle data? And the answer is because there is a reaction between the menstrual cycle and the vaccine. And it caused all sorts of things beyond, like, nothing that was, luckily there was a retrospective study done, nothing really dangerous came out of it. But what the dangerous thing that did come out of it that's not medical is distrust and fear in the vaccine system, because it ignored and tried to actively stifle the voices of the people who are saying, this did something to me and my doctor's pretending it's not. Isn't that a terrifying reinforcement of why people wouldn't trust Western medical sciences? Because it doesn't account for female experience. And when the female tells them it's impacting them, we ignore it.
In that regard, about the woman coming in and saying, like, okay, these are some of the side effects that I'm experiencing right now, I just wanted to dovetail on that comment you made about how the patient may be feeling as if they're not being heard or listened to.
Yeah.
How would you propose, let's say we have a physician who's listening to us right now. What are some of the ways in which you would recommend in terms of communicating with the patient to help the patient also understand that there are these existing gaps in research? Can you give some tips to those care providers to help patients better understand that it's not per se that they're being ignored, but more so it's this is just the way it is. This is how the research was made.
I would say that within the, like, especially when you listen to the online communities, especially of women who feel disenfranchised in the medical contexts in Western communities, there's a few, I would say, accidental crutches that we have linguistically in the healthcare context that continue to further the perception that we're not listening. So I think regardless of whether or not we mean them that way, they're taken that way. And so one of the ones is like, oh, that's normal for women of your age, or oh, that's normal for people going through pregnancy, postpartum, perimenopause, menopause. Welcome to menopause. That feels like, instead of an acknowledgement that what you're going through is a normal thing that people go through, that feels like that is a normal thing people go through. Suck it up. This is huge kind of like.
Yeah, no, I'm nodding my head a lot because I mean myself, we're patients too, right? So
Yeah.
I do hear that and it's very annoying. So
It's super annoying. And the other one that always gets me, and it's really tricky, is, and because there's to this point exactly, there's so little that's been studied that's female specific in the research basis. Well, there's no evidence for that. Okay, we only just, I saw a fascinating study that came out the other day. This is super funny, but they fed these pregnant people. One lady had there was like kale pills, and the other one was like sweet baby carrot pills or something like that. And then they took pictures in utero, and babies were like frowning if they had the kale pills and smiling if they had the carrot pills. And people forever have been saying like, oh, my baby loves it when I have ice cream when I'm pregnant or whatever. And there's like, well, there's no evidence that babies can taste anything in utero. And I just thought it was a really kind of funny, quaint sort of like, there's no evidence until there is, right? And so then this really cute paper came out with like pictures of grimacing babies that don't like kale. and so instead of a doctor being like, there's no evidence for that, because that could be true, but you can say, oh, there's no evidence for that, but wouldn't that make an interesting study? Like, wouldn't that be wonderful if someone was examining that? And I think what that does is it reframes that conversation to like, I acknowledge that what you're experiencing and that it seems to be a trend for you, and I wish I could offer you something valuable here, but my training unfortunately does not account for this. And that doesn't mean that what you're experiencing isn't real, but it also means that I have no diagnostic or interventional pathway forward with this information.
I love that. And I think that's very relevant to my work as an Eastern medicine provider, because I think we do have these emerging data. Well, not emerging, there's a lot of data that's out there about like acupuncture and all these different things that could be used. But then for certain physicians who are unaware or they're not up to speed with the research, might be miscommunicating some of the resources to the patient. So I really appreciate you highlighting on that note about making sure one should be more cognizant in how they communicate with patients. And I think that's also important for the patients themselves to be, I wouldn't say skeptical and be completely distrusted of the physicians per se, but more so be willing to go out there and learn a little bit more in terms of what are the possibilities. And I'm curious about, what do you think is essentially the barriers that's preventing better inclusion of women data, or just women in general, or even not just women, I think even other races as well within clinical trials? Because I think that's a big issue that we see for drug development sometimes too.
Yeah, I think it's this perception in part. There's like a few components here. I think it's this perception that there's this addition that we need to be making, right? So here's what a normal trial looks like, and there's all this additional cost and burden and complexity if we account for all of this stuff. My argument would be that that's not all of this stuff. That should be the baseline, right? So it's this perception of the other, even though we don't admit that, like, oh, it's the male proxy and that sort of thing that we just readily accept into all of our trials on.
Yeah.
So I think one, there's like retraining the brain. If we're doing population health, it needs to be representative of the population, and that isn't additional cost or complexity. That is the baseline cost and complexity to do this well. And then I think the other thing is that, unfortunately, because good scientists are trained to control our variables, to eradicate unnecessary complexities. Like we spend our entire careers learning how to cut things out that could be making our results more complicated. It seems counterintuitive to invite that complexity back in and potentially dilute your results or your ability to say something meaningful about the work that you're doing, right? So it's really challenging in that way. And then I think the third thing that I would say is that because then we've been trained in that way, it's hard to think of any other way in which it could be done, right? So if you grew up in a culture without telephones, and then somebody was like, well, just add telephones to all of your, homes, you'd be like, what am I going to use a telephone for? Like, it just doesn't make sense, because you're not from a space where that's something that's intuitive to you. And so I would say that right now we're going through like this learning curve as a community around, well, what would I even, how would I even start doing that? And I think that's a really big lift from like a cultural perspective.
In the United States, we've been really focused on like whole person care. We're talking more about personalized care. And I think there's a lot of reasons is associated with just the cost of healthcare in general within the United States has been substantially high, but people are continuing to get sick. So it's not like people are getting better and better and better. I'm just wondering, like, what is the climate right now in Canada from your perspective as a researcher, and what have you seen?
Yeah. So obviously, a few bits of context. Exactly. I think you said me blanch as soon as you said Toronto. So not from Toronto. I spent very little time in Toronto. I'm from Western Canada, but I think the consensus, probably much like the US, is that healthcare is really expensive. Like, it eats up a whack of our national budget in delivering care, and our population is growing, and there's growing complexity, and health equity is still a major concern. There's increased logistical demand and kind of challenges constantly. And there is a lot of conversation in like value-based care and precision health and personalized health and functional medicine. It's kind of all of these kind of confluential factors coming together in the Canadian context. I think the interesting kind of component that people have to, and this maybe leans into a little bit of a different audience, which is like the systems and financial folk, but in what ways can we better organize the system to decrease negative results and alienation that ultimately increased financial burden on the system and population, while making it as streamlined and unbumpy a process as possible. So there's
Right.
a meaningful return on investment that's not just like, oh, 20 years down the road, you'll see the health outcome from this, right? Because right now, a lot of the even preventative care stuff, it's like, well, you'll see a decrease in population costs 20 years from now when cancer rates are lower. It's really hard for a lot of governments around the world, not just Canada and the US right now, to make those big upfront investments. I think everyone's healthcare systems are pretty strapped for cash. And so finding those innovations that allow us to get there faster, and we have incredible talent, obviously, that are thinking meaningfully about these opportunities that account for the real lived and intersectional complexities of the population, I think is going to be key in driving that change.
Yeah, well said. I agree with you 100%. But regarding the different types of innovation, and I think any sort of innovation, one of the key things that you hear all the time is the measurable metrics of the outcome, whatever those outcome might be. Based upon your experience with normative and working with other researchers, how do you think data should be collected, accounting for the variances in terms of sex, gender, race, and other socioeconomic factors?
How do I think it's so? I think there's a few parts to that question. That was a really good question. It was a
Mhm.
multi-part question.
Yes,
There's
it is a
always a lot
multi-part
to
question.
it. So in terms of like, if we think about data capture, whether it's at a public health institution or a private health institution, I do think that there's been a push, at least in a lot of Canadian contexts, on like, what are the demographic factors that we capture,
Yeah.
and at what points do we need to increase and diversify those demographics? So as an example, when I was pregnant with my first child in Alberta, one of the pieces of demographic data capture that hadn't ever come up before at any of my regular medical checkups was CPTSD, anxiety, and mental health.
Hmm.
They do an automatic screen as soon as you fall pregnant in the province of Alberta, because there's been enough kind of policy change that says, like, this is a really dramatic change to a person's life if there are demographic factors such as CPTSD, anxiety, and other mental health conditions. Here, there's enough predictive capacity that's going to cause some problem down the road that it is worth us investigating now to kind of be able to provide appropriate support later on to prevent mental health crises and other things. And so that's not necessarily, you might get like a blanket, oh, do you have any mental health concerns from your doctor? But the specific levels of variable capture across the human life cycle change according to what you're going through as a person. What I would like to see kind of built in is more of that effectively. So recognizing that in particular, the female body fundamentally changes multiple times in its life
Hmm.
cycle. We can capture information. This is actually one of my favorite ones. People hate being asked what was the first day of your last period when they go to a hospital for something absolutely unrelated to potentially being pregnant, right? Everyone's like, I'm here for a head trauma wound. Like, don't ask me that question. This is outrageous. What I would invite us to think of it as, if we have that data on the first day of your last period, and then we can understand how recovery rates change according to hormonal variability at the rate of like injury, or there's so many cool things that we can do with that data beyond what it's actually intended for right now, that isn't as annoying as it is to be asked that question when you're like bleeding from your head.
Yeah.
It could be meaningful to contribute that to the data down the road, because to understand if estrogen has a protective factor or whatever it might be, right? So
Yeah.
I think capturing variables that are specific and unique to the female lived experience as we go through the life cycle of the female body will help unlock our understanding of how female physiology pairs into health experiences and health outcomes down the road.
Yeah, well said. I think you highlighted something where I think a lot of people don't realize is that these things, such as your period, your menstrual cycle, is associated with your hormones. It's not just, oh, I just bleed every single month, right? There's actually a reason to that. And there's a systemic relationship to other parts of your body as well. So this ties back into this whole person centric way of seeing a person. What I'm hearing is also an encouragement from the patient side to fill out your forms and don't be pissed off that we keep asking you certain questions. Because I mean, I know I do that in my clinic, right? So I think that's one. And then also the fact that when it comes down to the provider side, to make sure that they're also being astute in terms of making sure they collect some of the information that would be beneficial for the overall assessment of the patient down the line. So thanks for sharing
Absolutely.
that, because it's a very nuanced thing that I don't think people generally would even consider or think about. I know I wasn't really thinking about it in that way. So thank you.
Right? I
Yeah.
think people think of like that. What was that when you go in for the trauma wound and they're asking you
Yeah.
about your menstrual cycle? That the current reason for that is because like they're going to put you through a CT scan or something. And they're concerned
Hmm.
about other health impacts on a pregnant person,
Yeah.
but that data is actually good data. So if we can reframe it as now that we have this data point on when
Yeah.
that first the last bleed was, it can inform other scientific advances versus just protecting a pregnancy. It becomes less of a reductive kind of feeling, I think, if you are the female patient who's just trying to get your head wound checked out.
I think it's interesting because this is a little off topic a little bit, but just the psychology of being human. And I think because in my mind, when you're saying, okay, if I have a wound in my head and suddenly you're asking me all these other questions that are irrelevant to my head, then I would be like, well, why aren't you listening to me? I'm telling you, my head is hurting right now. So I think that goes back to, I
Yeah.
think, the initial conversation of what we were saying about how not being listened to. It's a perception that we probably need to be a little bit more forgiving within healthcare space.
Yeah, it's really like, especially in a hospital setting, like you're seeing people on the worst days of their lives, right? They're not
Yeah.
there for fun. And so it's really hard, I think, from a patient perspective to be gracious when you feel like you're being ignored in those contexts. From a professional services perspective, making sure like, I'm asking this, there's two things. Here's why I think this is going to be helpful for you. I think that's also really important from like an informed consent
Yeah.
and agency perspective, right? So when you're working with a patient, they should understand what you're doing and why they're doing it. And then they should also be able to consent to that happening. And so I think it's really valuable to, if we build in informed consent in all of these kind of processes we're undertaking, I
Yeah.
think it'll help patch up some of these misunderstandings around these questions we
Yeah,
ask.
I think your approach has always been so human centric, thinking about the individual, the person that you're collecting data from. I think now going into looking about health studies. So a lot of things that I'm also seeing is that some people would go on Google. There's a lot of resources now for them to go on to find information. What are some of the red flags that you think the public, so patients, for example, should be looking for in these various different types, so-called health studies?
Ooh, I mean, there's many things that we can start to point to here. I don't know how it is for the US, but in Canada, it's still pretty common for someone to ask for an ethical exemption for understanding sex-based differences based off of like an unnecessary need. Ethics will say like, oh yeah, no, it's fine. You don't actually have to account for women or measure them any differently. So it doesn't happen as much, but it does still happen. And so if sex and gender are not disaggregated in the study that you are reviewing, that means that the results have not been analyzed in a way that even allows for any differences to emerge across the population, right? So it's really, really, and same thing for racialized demographics or socioeconomic status kind of components, that the more that the tables you see in that study have that ability to broken down granularity for like an intersectional representation of who you are as a person, that means it's more likely that the work was done in a way that's going to illuminate how you might fit into this piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important that we understand not just the results, but the methods. So the way by which the data was captured,
Yep.
and then the way by which that data was parsed. So how we split it out, how we lumped it together, how we did all of that with it. And the more clarity and explicitity that is in the paper that you're reading or in the manuscript you're reading, the more likely it is for something to be beneficial.
Right.
Nodding to your, like, you can go on Google and find this out. It's kind of a funny example. My husband and I have banned Googling answers during the middle of a heated debate in our household because Google will provide you with, and now especially it's changed now, it's like an AI summary
Yeah. Yeah.
of what the definition of something is, or what is included in something, or what is not included in something. And even I was on a hemophilia panel, was it this week? Earlier this week. And still hemophilia, because of the historical literature that AI is scraping from, is defined as like a male specific disease, but males and females can be hemophilic or have other blood disorders. And so these answers that populate when you're like just quickly searching something are kind of these more like a cultural synopsis of what this thing has looked like in the past as our understanding of it, and not what the current literature says today. And so the query that we feed into these engines predetermines what the answer will be. And so we have to be really careful when we're searching for information on our health. It is wonderful. It is a democratic tool that anyone can use. And especially if we're new to the health and wellness space, we need to be really careful in the ways by which we are asking our questions, because it can ultimately feed faulty results back to us.
Right. I mean, I see that with ChatGPT. I'm not going to lie. I use it sometimes too to ask like personal questions about it, right? And you can tell that it kind of there is a little bit of a bias when ChatGPT or any of these AI tools that spit out to you. But I think another note that you mentioned that I also want to tie back into the initial part of this talk is that you did mention how the encounters and the relationship and also like the data that we get from each of these subsequent visits that we have with the patient right now could serve as a potential future study of whatever it is that we want to investigate. Because perhaps maybe the data and this research that was published many, many years ago was missing a big component of a certain population, right? So to your point, like this hemophilia study that you're mentioning here and that they're extracting the data from, it's all old. So then now we got to think about how about look at some of the research and the data that is more current, to your point about inclusion, looking at the inclusion exclusion criteria and the data analyses as well as the results when they're presenting it in the papers or the manuscripts. So I think that's really important for a lot of people who are coming up to a doctor's office with a review article, which is a meta-analysis that they got, but that meta-analysis is really compiling data points from so many different studies that it's not really a homogeneous description of whatever that particular case that could be affiliated to that patient.
Yeah, if you want to do that, if you want to get like a consensus on this, is going to be super nerdy, and any researcher is immediately going to put their head through a wall. But like, watch out for those meta-analyses unless they are systematic reviews. A systematic review is a great tool, right? So a systematic review is when, say, you set parameters. You're like, okay, I'm going to look at every paper published in this area that includes these three things that I care about between 2005 and 2025, right? And you're like, published in English in any sort of like Anglosphere, whatever nation, and that is publicly funded and whatever else. And then I'm going to take those results and I'm going to read all of them. And then I'm going to compile a list of like where there's consensus within these and where there are differences and what the strengths and weaknesses of the various arguments are. That is a great tool. That is an incredible tool to kind of look at. Broader, just kind of like high level meta-analyses lose that nuance. Whereas I would say like a systematic review kind of really brings those to the forefront and helps understand not only why something might be presented the way that it is, but how to improve on those things and features as we move forward. And I think those might help you also understand why the medical system or the intervention as it is today exists, how it is, even in instances in like serialized blood draws versus luteinizing hormone swatches, right? Like just trying to understand, okay, you know, my doctor recommended this protocol, not this protocol. If I did this protocol, it would cost me 100 times as much money. And so my doctor's bias is that they're trying to find like a cost-effective, low-burden thing that I'm more likely to be compliant on, even if the results aren't quote unquote as accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's that like finding of that even ground.
So the key takeaway I'm going to say here is that when you're looking at these papers, manuscripts, what have you, is be careful of what is in the inclusion exclusion criteria, the methodologies of how it's done and how it was analyzed, and also kind of like the quality of the study. So that could be utilizing a systematic review rather than just looking at the meta-analyses and so on and so forth. So I think this is kind of a good segue into more of the big digital health med tech sort of world now. I think you and I, when we were chatting, what drew me to you is because you were doing work that was also being applied into the health systems. And then I had shared with you how I was working in the health system space and also having experience with accelerators and working with startups, biotech, for example, who are trying to build up tools for health systems. So with that sort of context, let's say if we have an entrepreneur who's listening right now, how can some of these health tech companies better design their pilot or what have you to be inclusive in the data systems pathway?
That's a really good question. So I think the first question that I would ask myself is like, who do I intend to use this intervention with, or this innovation with? And if the answer is everyone, then unfortunately right now that means that we have to really on purpose go, okay, so how do we include the elderly? How do we include children? How do we include women who menstruate, or people who menstruate? How do we include pregnant people? How do we include perimenopausal people? That everyone is actually a lot bigger and more complex. And so I think it's really okay to be quite frank with yourself on like, who can I serve today? And how do I build myself the blueprint so that I'm not hard coding in bias, right? This is really, really important. So maybe you only have the budget to pilot this teeny tiny bit on this one population of 15 people, and you kind of recruit as much diversity into that cohort of 15 people as you can, but then you only have 15 people. So like what you don't have a ton of generalizable findings off of that, but you might have a handful of things that give you like pilot leading indication data. In that data, to the point we made earlier, parse it out, make it as granular as humanly possible, so that if there are emergent trends based on sex or variables associated with different demographic life stages or whatever that might be, make sure that that blueprint is there. And then if you do have some interesting findings in that, that's going to give you an incentive to go out and find additional funding opportunities or strategic partners to build out some supports around that variability that you see in the data, and kind of give you a justification for why you need to continue building out increased kind of capacity within whatever your innovation is to unlock that, right? I think that's kind of like a fundamental, just recognizing that some of these organizations are building technologies on 10 grand and a prayer, like just right? Like if you're building the minimum kind of like test case, the more granular you can get in that initial data capture, the more you're going to open up the doors for future understanding.
I think it's a catch-22 too, right? So let me explain what I meant by that. So it's a catch-22 because I agree with you. It's important for you to be granular and be specific so you can be very targeted in that particular segment of the population that you're trying to validate, right? But then when it comes down to these products, right, you want to capture the widest audience as possible. So some entrepreneurs have come to me and founders have asked me like, why shouldn't I ask for more money, for example, from an investor to do a big study? And I'm like, well, we need to focus on the smaller study first because it's also kind of like a feasibility study where you want to make sure you kind of like knock out any of the kinks of the research. Otherwise, you go into this big study and then you do all these things and then find out your entire approach is just all wrong.
Yes.
I'm kind of, yeah.
I think this will be my bias because this is what My Normative does. So I'm so sorry in advance, but like my recommendation would be go find pilot data. So go find like a medically de-identified cohort of 3,000 people with the variables that you want for the work that you're doing. And then have a hypothesis and go into it and get as much diversity into that as you can. And then split it out and say, okay, this is my initial hypothesis. Then from there, go to your feasibility, like go to your study actually in your first subset. So like go from that, say, okay, I looked at MS in women between the ages of 18 and 35. And I think that that population might be experiencing MS differently than people who are perimenopausal, right? Or from males. And so you kind of go in and you gather whatever data you can. You go, okay, from the public sector data that I can access or from collaborators at different universities who have these data sets already, here's what I see. And then from there you go, okay, so my hypothesis is in this. You go and you collect your moderately set, you grab a sample of 100 people and you do your prospective component. And your prospective component shows you that not only did those variables that you identified in the initial data set show you something, but there's also this additional 15 to 20 variables. So different symptom reports, different life experiences, different biometrics, heart rate variability, basal body temperature shifts that are correlated with these other time to event kind of components or health outcomes. Then you can go back into a big data set again and go, okay, now that I know that this specific thing based on my sample of 100 people is correlated to these 6 things, I can now go ask the data for those 6 things in addition to the original cohort I had. And now I'm going to be looking for generalizability with what I'm doing, right? So you can grab a baby data set, test out a hypothesis, as long as you can find the variables you're looking for, then go run your small prospective initial study, and then go back to the data set and look for generalizability, right? I think there's a really meaningful process to be done in doing it that way.
That's great. So just to clarify, this is what My Normative is about, right? Utilizing, having that capability of looking at very small data sets and then finding that parallel to a bigger pool of data that is kind of like from all over the place, which is one of the biggest challenges for people who are running like clinical trials or pilots, for example. Do you find that there's any specific chronic conditions or illnesses or rare diseases, for example, that is impacted by flawed data that could benefit from utilizing something like My Normative to help them with a clinical design for a product that they're trying to build, or even perhaps just for patients? Maybe the data about this particular chronic disease is not really strong right now, so that would provide them a little bit more hope or understanding about their current state. So that's actually a two-part question. So the first one is about for the founders and the creators and innovators in the biotech and health tech industry, what do you see as like a common chronic condition that is impacted by flawed data that they could use My Normative for? And the second question is from a patient perspective, how can they utilize that information to understand about chronic conditions and how flawed the data is for those specific chronic conditions?
Yeah, so I think there's some pretty good stats out there, and I'm so sorry to everyone who's listening because this is not the field that I play on a day-to-day basis. So I'm gonna. This is my caveat of like these are approximate, off the tip of my tongue statistics that I could be misinterpreting as a scientist. I just want to like your recall after so many years in the field gets a little bit wonky, but there's some incredible statistics out there about really common, something like 80% of autoimmune disorders disproportionately and differently impact women and female identifying individuals. 80%, like it's an astronomically high number. And so when we think about Crohn's and colitis, or we think about MS, or we think about kind of all of these different, there's so much work in that. Again, maybe this is a little bit, but like chronic illness is a lucrative space for people who are doing like investments in long-term ongoing care intervention stuff, profitable sector, and yet it's still chronically underserved. It's predominantly women and female impacting, right? So it's this really weird sort of space where there's a huge opportunity for innovation.
Yeah.
Alzheimer's is another one that disproportionately impacts women and female identifying people. Osteoporosis and hip replacements. I'm not going to even try this one, but hip replacements are almost like it's an outrageous percentage. It's like 70% of hip replacements, it might even be more than that, are done in the female population. And yet the tools aren't specifically designed to work with female hips. Like it just
doesn't make any sense.
Just make it make sense, right? There's so much opportunity in the health sector that is fundamentally fascinating to me. The other one is on the oncology space. I saw a paper came out recently that finally was like, yeah. Depending on where you are in your menstrual cycle, your interaction with your chemotherapy will vary. The efficiency and uptake changes while you still have a menstrual cycle, depending on where you are in your cycle. But when we capture initial data on cancer, like we don't capture menstrual cycle data. Why would we? And so it's really challenging. Like if we know that things are disproportionately or differently impacting the female body, we should be capturing variables specific to the female body so that we can understand how those things interact with those specific chronic conditions, so that we can find solutions faster that might be correlated to either sex-specific or different gender-specific experiences of health.
Tying it back to that whole health, integrative health kind of standpoint is to what you just mentioned about how the responsiveness to certain treatments, right, is impacted by the hormonal makeup that we have. And some people really want to work with an integrative medicine doctor or a provider to boost up their body in order for them to be able to manage or take on that chemo drug or whatever active treatment they're currently under. So that was very validating to hear, because I do see that clinically, but it's more of nobody ever really said that out loud, because when you're in a cancer institution, the focus is always about get the cancer, kill the cancer, and that's all the focus is. Very little is really focused upon the whole person. But I think that's a lot of that has been changing now. So thank you for the insight.
Yeah, and I think one of the big pieces, and I touched on in the end, is that anyone who's telling you that it's just biological and not sociocultural is
Mm-hmm.
also potentially selling something. And I know we've talked a lot about biology in this particular conversation, but women access care differently than men. Women have
Mm-hmm.
different social and cultural burdens that will inform when they get to the doctor, how they get to the doctor, whether or not they can go to the doctor because they have child minding
Mm-hmm.
responsibilities. There's all of these social and cultural constraints as well. When we talk about like whole person treatment,
Yeah.
my favorite one, just as a new mom again, like physiotherapy and pelvic floor rehab with 2 young children, that is a wish list down the road, because it's not even in Canada, like physiotherapy is not covered, pelvic floor physio postpartum is
Mm-hmm.
not covered. So you have to have the financial ability. You need to be able to get yourself to your appointments. You need to have somebody who can take care of your children while you go. There's
Yeah.
all of these social and cultural burdens that then lead to a wild number of women as they age, or people who've had children, having urinary incontinence or even fecal incontinence as they age, and it's not because they're not interested and they don't know that it's important, but it's because socially and culturally they can't get there. And that's a huge, when we talk about whole person care, we need to account for those. That's why socioeconomic factors are really important in accounting for
Yeah.
the health outcomes that we see.
Love it. You know, the other thing that I love what you mentioned so far is the advocacy and the commitment towards women's health and femtech. And I think it's important to also note that in the industry, femtech is growing significantly. What are some of the promising solutions or innovation that you have seen, or maybe some of the things that you wish could be in play right now?
One of the things I'm really grateful for is that we're not really in like the early innings of femtech
Mm-hmm.
anymore. We're kind of
Mm-hmm.
in the middle of the road right now. And so what's exciting about being in the middle of the road is that we're seeing big incumbents also shift. And what
Mm-hmm.
that's doing, validating some of the components of the market that have been percolating for the last 20 years plus, but also giving small organizations to partner with that have capacity and bandwidth and breadth and an interest in this space. And in particular, I think of the pivot that Aura did in the last couple of years to focusing on female health, and actually focusing on female health, right? So when you capture the data, like what is the data we're capturing? What does it mean? And how do we contextualize it and provide
Mm-hmm.
insights? Garmin is doing a really good job in this space as well. Again, they're still, I would say, like early days in that transition into women's health isn't other, but a fundamental baked in part of what we do. So it's really nice to see kind of pieces like that. We have organizations like Evie who are doing like vaginal microbiome work, which is really exciting and interesting to see because it's a very untapped market. I think up at University of Warwick, they're doing a menstrual blood biobank, which is fascinating and so important. You get all sorts of cancer markers and fascinating pieces up there. Kind of, I think all of these things ultimately come down to like hormonal health as like that missing biomarker that should be included in everything. And it's really exciting because then once the data capture, whether it's biometric or a biomarker, improves and is more serialized and more nuanced over time, then we can start to get the depth to the data that we need to then go do those quick retrospectives, have a hypothesis, test things out, and then go do those feasibility studies faster.
Right.
And the faster we can move with science, the faster we can move with new treatments, new diagnostics, and new protocols.
I wanted to kind of like round this up a little bit because I think when we going back to your initiative of My Normative is obviously because you saw that there was this gap of data and equity. So I wanted to ask you for the listeners, what's the one thing you wish more people could understand about data and health equity, and any other thoughts that you have in that realm, as well as My Normative and how people could utilize My Normative to enhance the ecosystem?
That's a really good question. So I think maybe this is more of like not so much a one thing I wish people knew, but I think one thing I wish people felt, which is that it's safe to collaborate. I
Yeah.
think women's health has been so underfunded for so long that it's hyper competitive, and there's only one right way of doing things, and there's only one project out of all of these to get funded, so it's got to be the best one, or my data is superior to everyone else's data, or my method is better than everyone else's method. And I think that there are thousands of lifetimes worth of work to be done in this space. So whether you hold a technology or data capture mechanism or a data set or a methodology around data, those are all important pieces of the pie, of the puzzle. And if we're going to all move so much faster if we bring those pieces together. And so if you are a stakeholder in this space and you have insight and thought I think the best thing that I can do is I'm a safe person. You can reach out to me. You talk to me what you're doing. I would love to learn about what you're doing, but reach out to the community around you and see how you can collaborate with them.
I think that is very true. We're seeing the silos, even in innovation, right? Like, I don't know how many different AI tools that are out there or how many different products, but if everybody just worked together collectively, I think we could really develop something even greater. Can you share a little bit more about My Normative and a call to action or even a direction of how to be able to collaborate and work with you in the future?
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to share that. So there are three ways that we work with folks. One is in what we call collect. So collect is for that prospective work. So if you have a project you want to run that is creating new data and you are wanting to create new knowledge with that, we have some really great technologies that decrease the cost and logistical burden of accounting for sex and gender-based variability, including hormonal state fluctuations, that we would love to have an opportunity to talk to you about and try to make your research more cost effective and move faster. The other ways by which we work with people is through two programs called Contribute and Catalyze. So if you are a person who has a technology or a piece of data or an interesting idea or a methodology, please talk to us. We contribute it to the pot. Like we will work with you to make sure that it is represented and used appropriately in the case. Like we would love to work with you to move things faster. If you have an idea, a data set that could be used to move women's health forward faster, please come contribute it to the pot, I guess is the short answer on that one. There's lots of different models for making that work. And then for Catalyze, the big piece is if you are working on something and you haven't been able to understand how sex and gender-based variables are impacting your space, we can do a couple of things. So one, we can embed it on the back end and see if through machine learning we can work through it. But the big opportunity too there is kind of saying like, what data could we access through all of our contribution partners to figure out how to get through a pilot faster, get through some basic data faster, figure out if there's a correlation between sex and gender and the variable results you're seeing in your work. And then from there, kind of design and get projects through and products through de-risking faster. So if you're interested in working with us in either the collect, the contribute, or even the catalyze kind of component, I would love to learn more about what you're working on and see if there's a way that we could help you move forward.
Thank you so much. So I will have all of your contact information in the show notes so
Yes.
people can definitely reach out to you. I really appreciate your openness to helping entrepreneurs and founders and researchers and patients. So I have three questions that I did not give you ahead of time because I
Oh
wanted to
no.
be as candid as
Okay.
possible. And it's really because Road to Wellness, the podcast, is really focused upon like health and wellness, right? I kind of segued more focused in the evidence-based component and also from a founders and investor standpoint, because I think all of that is important for the growth of health and wellness. And I wanted to ask you these three questions because it's about you as a founder, about you as a person who is a mother and having to work. You are a hardworking woman. You've become very successful in building this business. So, if you could provide one piece of advice to improving another founder or one's health and well being, what would you say?
I mean, I think the thing that I often have to tell myself that I maybe wish I heard from others is like, you're doing enough.
Oh, that's true. That's good. You
Right?
are.
Like, I think there, there, there are thousands of lifetimes worth of work to be done, and
Yeah.
so if you, the most valuable asset to your organization is you, and this is advice I need to constantly give myself. And so, if you know, like my baby just turned 1, and my other one is 3, if I'm showing up to meetings and you know I haven't slept in 2 or 3 days because it's been a bad night, and I'm kind of debating with myself on like, can I afford to take a half day off? If you aren't recovered, if you aren't rested, if you haven't given yourself time to like let your brain fix itself with a good night's sleep, what you're going to be able to bring to yourself and to your organization is going to be greatly diminished. And so yes, you should, like, this is assuming you are a super hard diligent worker who is ambitious and wants to move the needle. If those things are all true, I think the best thing you can do for your organization is give yourself permission to breathe.
I like it. Sometimes we just need to hear that from somebody else. So I appreciate you saying that. I can empathize it so much. Question number two is, what do you currently see as the most important thing in life?
What is the most
Yeah.
important thing in life?
And you can only choose one thing, one most important thing.
So personally or professionally, I guess.
I guess you can say one for personal and one for professional.
So I have relinquished that, and this is one of those funny things that you learn
Hmm.
about yourself. To me, one of the most important things in life is beauty.
Hmm.
I love beautiful things. It can be a beautiful day. It could be how the light shines off a tree. It could be a very beautiful designer dress. It could be my fingernails after a manicure. It could be my babies running around in the lake. It could be whatever. But like a life full of beauty is inspiring to me. And if I am inspired and energized and excited by my life because of beauty, I should pull as much around me as I can.
I love it. It elicits joy,
It
right?
does.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's the beauty of it is that it elicits joy. And now the third and final question. If you can have one do-over, what would it be?
Oh, one do-over.
Yeah.
One do-over. Oh, that is a really hard question. If I could have one do-over, I don't want to give the pat answer of like nothing. If I could have one do-over, I would be more audacious when I first set out.
Ooh, you're the second woman who I know who said that she wished she had been more daring sooner. Do you care to elaborate a little bit there?
I think socially for women founders and for female founders, there is unfortunately this bias of like we will evaluate you by what you have accomplished and not what you will or have the capacity to accomplish. And so I spent a lot of time cutting back my vision and how I thought things could progress to fit
Mm,
the molds of people who and organizations who saw me for where I was as like this teeny tiny
mm,
opportunity based off of what I had accomplished so far with like no money, no resources, no nothing. And so like, okay,
mm,
this is the
mm.
opportunity. And I didn't feel like I had a lot of power to negotiate or to push back or to say this isn't worth my time, right? What I think, and I don't know if this is the same in the US, but like in Canada, you better say yes, and if not yes, I'm not the right fit for that, but let me introduce you to someone who is. Like the Canadian no is like, let me introduce you to someone who's a good fit for that. So saying no to accelerators, saying no to coaching and mentorship, you like this like very, oh, you like this person is uncoachable, they're snobby, or that whatever, this is not a good opportunity. There's this really negative perception of like guarding your time and asking for what you're worth and knowing when something's not a good opportunity. And so there's a lot of social pressure to kind of bow to that and then adjust your expectations accordingly. I think that was a huge impediment to the early growth of the work that we're doing.
Wow. Wow. Bottom line is you're just gonna have to believe in yourself, right?
Believe
Believe
in yourself.
in yourself, believe in what you do. More and more as I gotten older, I learned that it's like your gut feeling. I do believe in that sense of intuition a lot.
You do.
But I love this, Danica. Thank you so much for spending time with me on a Friday. It's been a great conversation. I don't know how you feel about it, but
It was wonderful. Thank you for having
no,
me.
I definitely have some things I wanted to work with you on. And I'm also part of an incubator here in Los Angeles. So definitely gonna share your information amongst my group. I'm Amy Truong. This is Danika Kelly. If you like what you heard, please give us 5 stars, like, share with your friends. Be well, take care of yourself, and we'll talk to each other again soon.